Anyway, welcome everybody. And this will be the second of our get-togethers. It was so much fun last week because I actually got to see people I haven't seen in years from all over. Actually,
we haven't seen you in years, years and years,
probably ever.
right?
Or ever. It's good to meet for the first time. And you know what's so wonderful about this is it's a chance for, usually I'm very segmented in the communities I address. Like I'll be talking to people who are just strictly musicians, or people who are strictly classical listeners, or a lot of times just students, like in my orchestra. And so it's nice about this that we can have people. I can have this wonderful mixture. So last week it was wonderful. I had an expert in Baroque music talking, and I also had a wonderful composer, two wonderful composers from Boston that chimed in as well. So I think this is really wonderful. Last week we talked about, I started off the topic trying to suggest that a great beginning for listening to music, any music, not just classical music, is to just to banish the phrases, I like it or I don't like it.
Yeah.
Because so much of that brings in, it's about you rather than the music. And I think the real key to listening is listening, where you're starting to take something that is not you projecting out to the world, but trying to receive something new inside, and holding at abeyance that judgment, so that you can actually open yourself to a whole new world of experience and listening. Someone asked a very important question, which I did not fully answer intentionally at the end of that. And I said, instead of judging I'd like or not like it, I said, how well is something wrought? How well is it put together? Or how is it put together? And so the question was, well, how do you know that? Well, I think this series of talks that we're going to have, it will start to answer that question. And I think that really is a wonderful vector to use as a means of trying to talk about this wonderful thing about classical music listening. How is something wrought, and what makes something well wrought or not? And so I'm going to be directing you in topics, and we'll get to that by degrees. So last week we started just with the idea of what it's like to experience something you didn't like at first and then grew to love, which I think is one of the most powerful types or genres of experiences I have all the time in not just music, but all fine art. Doesn't mean that there's not bad art as well. There is good and bad art, but the idea is not to be judging it by your personal prejudices, but by whether something is true to its own laws and rules that it creates as it goes. So today I thought it would be a lot of fun to talk about favorite moments in music, because I haven't heard anyone discuss this as a topic before in music listening. And when I look at music listening books, they never mention this. And yet, what is more attractive to us to listen to music than the emotion that we personally feel about moments? And we all have them, right? Every single one of us has our favorite moments in music. They may be changing all the time, but we're darn sure that ours are the best. There is no question of it. And I think it's worth just spending a little time to talk about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a presentation for like 20 minutes or so. And then I'm going to turn it over to all of you. And then we're going to hear everyone else's ideas about it, or links of music you want to share with us, or just particular pieces. And I think it's going to be a pretty beautiful session. So
interject one quick thing.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. I watched all 3 movements of your flute sonata on YouTube. And over on the side, there was last week's talk on YouTube. You recorded it, which is very nice of you, because I didn't get to see it. So now listening to hear you discuss what happened makes me want to watch all that. And so thank you for doing that. It's on your YouTube channel, I guess, which I just subscribed to. So thank you for doing that. So if anyone is curious to see it, it's there.
Thank you, David. The reason I didn't mention it is because I got flagged on it, because if you guys remember, I love it. I can play all the classical music, and they'll never be concerned about that. But I also played 2 popular pieces all along the Watchtower in both the Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix versions. So they flagged me on that. So they had to mute all of that in order to publish, which I thought was very funny. So that's why I haven't, haven't mentioned that.
I didn't know. Sorry about that.
No, so it's no problem. So if you listen to it, that part of the thing will be muted.
Because of the copyright?
Funny.
Because of copyright?
Because of copyright.
Yeah, right,
Of course,
right.
I'm just taking all of these off of YouTube, but yeah, that one is monetized.
Got it. Thank you.
So as you know, we can do any classical piece we want, but
yeah.
forbid we do any pop piece.
Yeah.
So that I thought that was really funny. In other words, there was no copyright on the Apache song that I played. That was fine. You guys remember last week I played this wonderful recording from around 1900 of a Native American song. And I was telling you that was one of kind of an epiphany for me, in which I thought I really knew music really well and discovered that it was a different world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about favorite moments, and so I wrote a few notes about it. I think it's worth discussing because favorite moments are our payoff, right? That's these are the moments that incite strong emotional response in us. They may make us feel elated. And we all know music that literally brings us to tears. When I hear Andi Musik, we know music that moves us to move our bodies. Music that makes us sad, music that fits all kinds of our moods, but it produces a reaction. Or conversely, sometimes we're in a particular mood and we just want to hear a particular piece of music because we know it embodies that emotion and will amplify it. And the reason I wanted to start with this idea is because it doesn't matter whether you are someone who just listens to house music or party music or hip hop or whatever, or whether you're someone who's really into very arcane 20th century experimental music. The payoff is the same. These moments that strike us so powerfully emotionally. And I think it's worth exploring them a little bit because they're the payoff for listening to entire pieces. That's basically my thesis, is that these moments are what get us to want to listen to entire pieces of music. And because we're listening for the favorite part to come on, right? We all have this experience. We're waiting for the good part to come on. You get through all the garbage, then you get through the good part. And then what invariably happens for us as classical listeners is we become very interested in what led up to that emotional moment and then what happens after. And our attention starts to focus on these other moments. And what's so extraordinary is we start to see connections between what we like so much and other parts of the piece. And I think what's very common is our favorite moments start to shift to other parts of the piece. I mean, I remember specifically for myself, the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven was one. My favorite moment was at the end of the first movement where you have the rainbow. With that beautiful descending scale. And then I started to notice how that idea was built up step by step through the whole piece. And I started to have favorite moments through the entire symphony till it got to the point where every single moment of the symphony was my favorite moment. And that seems to be the case now. So that's one of the things about favorite moments I wanted to mention. The other thing that's really interesting is what makes a favorite moment. I'm saying it's a favorite moment because that moment can be an entire section of music. It might be a couple of phrases of music, or that moment could be just a chord, just one chord. I have a friend, Leo. I don't think he's on here now, but Leo, I was talking about the Mahler Sixth Symphony. The Mahler Sixth. It's a big Zoftig piece, right? Goes on forever. And he's saying, oh, that symphony has my favorite chord. And there's one moment he loves that has that one chord. And that was just such a fascinating idea to me, that a single chord and its position there could be the thing that flowers your understanding for an entire symphony. So what I thought I'd do is I'm going to share, since this is my broadcast first, I'm going to share 3 of my favorite moments. And then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. And so I picked three of my favorite moments that elicit all three of these types of things. So my first of my favorite moments is the interior of the Bach Chaconne, the famous Chaconne for violin, which I like to hear on guitar. And so here's my guitar. And so you all know how it begins. And that starts off a cascade of some of the most astonishing variations. One reason I love it on guitar is because as it proceeds, it so clearly has a flamenco quality. The whole saraband idea, actually, which is a Spanish dance anyway, it becomes more and more flamenco. But then my favorite part is after the first third in D minor, you have this glowing, beautiful section that is so intimate in D major. And my favorite part is just the beginning of that, this part. And then it goes off to this gorgeous melodic part. And then you're off to something more ornate. But that simple beginning at D major, it just always gets to me, it makes me cry. There's just such a great beauty in it. The intimacy after so much virtuosity to just go to such simple texture and yet such exquisite counterpoint. It just, for me, embodies everything I love most about harmony and counterpoint coming together. And that whole section is a special part to me. And then afterwards, the piece goes back to D minor and then gets even more virtuosic. It takes you on this series of a rainbow of climaxes. So exciting. But that moment in the center, for me, always evokes a very powerful emotional response. And it leads me to want to unveil and discover more about the entire piece. So that's an example of, for me, an entire section of music that is just my favorite section. There's every note in that section to me is just perfect. And it's one reason the Chaconne is one of my most favorite pieces of music. The second example is more a couple of phrases. And this is music I just love from the beginning of my life. As many of you know, I'm totally crazy about the Brahms intermezzi, these gorgeous piano pieces, short piano pieces that Brahms wrote. And of all of them, every single one is great. But my favorite one is the E major intermezzo from Opus 116. Here, let me put it down so you can see the keyboard. And it's the one that begins with tremendous sentimentality. Really, some of them sound almost like they're cabaret songs. So this one starts. It has all these connotations of kind of cheap music, which I find, this is one reason I guess the piece to me is so sublime, because of what he does with that. So it begins. Such a surprising answer. And then again. So it's a very beautiful moment. But the part that just slays me, kind of like the Chaconne, but in more miniature, is the middle section, where you have this absolutely blissful pedal on a pedal tone, and then the most exquisite harmonies, the kind of harmonies in a certain way that are going to foreshadow Debussy and Impressionism in a way. But there's something deeper to me about them than what any of the French did. And you just hear it, and he has for the soft pedal. That is just some of the most beautiful music I know, and it gives shivers down my spine every time I hear it. You know, there's just something so delicate and exquisite. The way he puts these, you know, that's a jazz chord. That's a 13th chord, but it's not. It's like an invented harmony with them. The way it's spaced. And so I just kind of quell in that. And then how could you even get to something more emotional and greater? He goes down a fifth. And this makes somehow the feeling twice as deep. And then the great surprise, he brings in that sentimental opening but after hearing it in the guise of this passage that came before, it has a profundity to it. And this beautiful rainbow that ends it. Totally favorite moment. And then it goes back to the opening section. Etc. But that's again an example of a passage, of a few phrases that are my absolute favorite. Again, I'm talking about the music from an emotional standpoint, and we always, at least when I say we who talk about music, we composers, like those of you I see out there, a lot of you composers here, you know, we always are very much in our heads, you know, intellectually about how things are put together and how they work, how things balance. And we don't talk as much about just the sheer level of feeling. And so I thought it would be really interesting to do that, because the reality is, whether we're listening to Webern, you know, Schoenberg, Lutoslawski, I mean, any of the 20th century composers, or whether we're listening to Brahms, or whether early music, this is what I think is our motivation. So that's the second of the, I'm going to get to the last one in a second. Now, one thing I wanted to say is a favorite moment. You know, these are kind of prominent sections. They're kind of like in the middle of pieces. But a favorite moment often is not the climax of a piece. And I think what's so interesting about favorite moments is the more experience you have as listeners, the more subtle your favorite moments become. And a lot of times your favorite moments will be like side streets and alleys, you know, places way off the beaten track in a piece. But that's that moment that does it for you. And that's what makes it interesting. My third favorite moment, which is really my absolute favorite moment in music, is this. It's really only 2 chords. So I'm not as delicate as my friend Leo with 1 chord. So it's 2 chords, but these 2 chords to me are the most beautiful chords in music. And they have a passing tone, a paginatura they start with. Just that. And you guys probably, many of you probably know what that is from, right? Anyone? That's from the slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And it was the, I think those measures have influenced me probably more than any music I've heard in my life, because when I started to hear them over and over, they produced a sadness in me that I can't really describe, but it was a deep feeling that helped me to understand not only all of that symphony, but all of Beethoven in a certain way. And I think there's a genius to those just those chords. And of course, it's the way he builds up to it, right? Because you begin with the cellos. It's certainly expressive. Very kind of like a military march. And then you're just not ready for the woodwinds to come in with this. And it's such a shift, an abrupt, dramatic, emotional shift. You know, there's a lot of things you can talk about, the orchestration and all the things that lead up to it, but just moving to the minor there, and here a minor seventh going, it just takes my breath away every time. And then, you know, later on when the strings have this very expressively. But it's that one moment with the woodwinds that just gets to me. And for me, when I was younger, those measures inspired me to, you know, I wanted to always hear them, but it inspired me to listen for those connections in the rest of the symphony, even more than, that became something that helped me to understand how the piece was put together. There's a lot of intellectual secrets going on with that too, but the emotional one is what I wanted to talk about. I think the last thing I just wanted to say is the favorite moments are what are our payoff, emotional payoff to listening. And I think they're what give us the catalyst to want to listen repeatedly to music. And in the music we love, as you know, it's not one-time listening. The secrets in the music we love only really become revealed after multiple listenings. And I think that sense of favorite moment is that payoff that compels us to want to do that. I think one of the problems people have with a lot of contemporary music is that when they don't feel any of those favorite moments, they don't want to hear it again. My piano teacher was very fond of expressing his dislike for Arnold Schoenberg, who he attended a concert and lecture of Schoenberg's at UCLA, and Schoenberg said, you know, as someone raised their hand, they said, well, you know, we don't like your music. And he said, well, you have to listen to it 100 times, 100 times. And then you will like it. And then, you know, my piano teacher would say to me, well, I don't think I'm going to be listening to any of that 100 times. And I think, you know, I thought that was really funny when I was younger, but I think to put it in the context of what we're talking about, why not? Because he didn't have any favorite moment in that would draw him to listen to that 100 times. But if you listen to, there are, you know, once you do listen to the Schoenberg in certain ways that I've shown many of my my participants, you can start to get very hooked on some of these melodies and little passages. And just like with any other masterwork, that once you have that anchor, that can allow you to hear the whole thing. But I think we don't talk about these moments and just how significant they are to being able to compel us to want to spend time with music. Because let's face it, it takes a lot of time to spend with music for it to reveal its secrets. So that's what I wanted to present. I'd like to hear from you guys. What are your favorite moments or any comments on this stuff? Let's see how I can start to see people here. So I'm still fiddling around with Zoom. Any of you?
If I can, no one wants to jump in.
Hi, David.
Hi, Russell. Immediately when you said favorite moments, I had kind of two spots. I'll send them in the chat.
Okay.
So you can. There's two different YouTube videos. The first one is to Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, and there's a spot where there's just real heavy 16th notes, the 32nd notes going on in the strings, and they're just going up and down and up and down, and then it all dissolves away. You just have the horn line, and you can click it. I think I've put the right spot in, but it's
that's a favorite moment.
Yeah. Da 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 da.
Yeah.
And it gives me shivers every time, and that's one of the things that usually draws a favorite moment to me, is something in a piece where every time I listen to it, it's an arrival, and I get shivers down my spine, and it's just such a wonderful feeling.
I think that's a great one. Yeah. I think that's a great one to mention, because I think that's one that, there's some favorite moments that are very unique to specific listeners. And there are others that are kind of universal. Like the most universal moment I know is the transition from the third movement to the fourth movement in the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, right? With a C. Where the violins go up to heaven and that crashes. And I think the Sibelius Fifth Symphony is another one that is kind of universal, because the entire piece is leading up to that moment. And so I think that's a really good point. I remember reading, I'm a Rachmaninoff fan, and I remember reading about how Rachmaninoff would instruct composition students that every piece had a single moment it led to and receded from. So, there's this kind of idea of a wave in music. And he said the trick for the skill of the composer is how well they understand how to prepare that moment and how well they understand how to leave that moment. And if you know Rachmaninoff's music, it does have that, the waves are very, very literal in that way. And I think the Sibelius Fifth Symphony is a great example of that. So and because, David, because we're sitting there for so long, that's another reason that moment is so great, that big melodic payoff after so much time with just melodic fragments, right?
Right, yeah.
That's a great example. Yeah. So what else? Let's as soon as I get out of the yeah, go ahead.
So at the other end of the spectrum, not leading up to, but one of my favorite pieces of music is the Brahms second piano concerto, started basically piano concerto. That little one that he did.
Yeah, the tiny one, like his tiny symphony.
That's what he called it.
Tiny symphony.
And it just starts right off with this glorious horn theme, and everything that follows comes from it. But you are immersed in the first moment in this theme that just takes you right in. And you don't have to wait till it finally builds. It is there, and you're captured.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's some, a lot of moments are immediate like that. Absolutely. The Brahms, I agree with you. Although there's so much more in that concerto, right?
Oh, no, it's every other concerto rolled into one.
And symphony and everything.
There's can you hear me, Russell?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, there's an electrifying moment in that concerto, and I'm sure I saw it, where the soloist reaches and strikes both the high C and the low A on the piano at the same time.
Well,
I'm sure it's in
they're B flats you're talking about.
Huh?
The high B flats, high and low B flat.
Well, I mean, he had the end, both end keys on the piano. It looked like maybe.
Well, it seems like it. It's not the actual ones, but yeah, he goes all the way. He has the whole. I think the whole register of the piano of the B flats.
And the reason it was electrifying is because I saw him do it. I done. It was in a very quiet moment, and all of a sudden he looks like a buzzard with his wings out. And it was just this very quiet moment with this bottom and top notes on the. That was electrifying.
Yeah, it is. Did you hear what Paul said? He wanted to know, was that when you heard Brahms do it? I think that's what Paul was asking.
Good, Paul. I'll get you for that.
Yeah, you heard him do it.
Brahms didn't have the high C that we had. He had only 7 octaves. He had the same low A, but his piano only went up to A.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you. I've brought that up a couple of times with Russell, as for instance, whether Beethoven had an 88 key piano at his disposal or not. Of course he didn't.
Yeah, no, he helped to expand the piano, but he didn't have that himself. Yeah. Yeah, although pianos, even in his lifetime, were being built with more keys. By the way, that's my dear friend Noam Elkies. Here, I just want to say a big hi to Noam, who is he and I were colleagues at Harvard together, and he's a mathematician, but also such a skilled composer and performer.
Thanks.
So, and Noam plays with his nose too. He's not only has both hands out here. He figured out how to transcribe the Bach organ toccatas and sonatas for his for piano by using his nose for the inner voice. And,
Nothing to sneeze at.
It's really something.
Especially these days. I don't have an example of. I was surprised that you brought up the Chaconne. Because actually my favorite moment is right after that. Of course, I'm not a guitarist or even a violinist, and so I know it in Brahms's transcription, and Brahms puts a forzando there.
Right.
And now we're starting it thrown back to, yeah. By the way, we feel that it's the first 1/3, the second third, the third third of the piece, but of course the first quote unquote third is actually more than half the length of the whole thing.
You know, that brings up such a good point, Noam. First of all, I want to say that moment you're talking about was my teacher, Kenneth, my first composition teacher who taught me the piece. He made a point of saying that moment with the B flat was his favorite moment too. And he played the Brahms version you're talking about.
Right.
So that was my first favorite moment, but then I just fell in love with the earlier moments. So I agree with both of those things. What I wanted you bring up, and this is going to be the topic for another session we have, is the difference between temporal, actual chronologic time and psychological time. Because like Noam is saying, it's true, the three sections are not chronologically are not equal at all. The first part is by far the longest, and the middle part is the next long, and then the return is much shorter. But psychologically, it feels like three parts. And I think one of the things I want to bring up is that psychological time in music is very different than chronologic, and that was a big breakthrough for me later when I started to figure out how to talk about how to follow music, because it's the psychological moments we remember better than the actual physical length of time. In fact, we're incredibly, as listeners, we're really terrible at guessing how long or short different passages are. As I mean, we all know the joke. You can listen to, music you love like Chopin for hours and it seems like 5 minutes, or you can listen to, you can listen to
Bruckner.
For Bruckner or someone, where 5 minutes feels like 5 hours.
Yeah.
And I think there's something very there's something deep in that, and it does tie into what we're talking today because it has to do with how you are stirred that way. And when you are, one of the things I wanted to mention about favorite moments is that they stop time, they arrest our attention, and we're not aware of time passing when we're hearing them in a certain way. And that's one of the great powers of music, actually, even though at least
Sorry.
Do I have to mute you? No. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's a good point. And Noam, I think your favorite passage, I commend that. So these are all great pieces. How about some other people?
Hey, I have something to ask.
Great.
For the composers among us, did you ever compose a piece and you try to figure out what to do? You don't know how to write it. And so I've had the experience where the favorite moment comes to me first, and that's the door into the piece. And then I say, oh my God, I better write a whole piece that contains this. And so I have to figure out how it begins, because it's usually not at the beginning. And especially studying vocal music, where I'm responding to poetry, there might be some image and then a musical idea comes. And then the question is, what piece does this go into? So I think it's not just listening, but in composing, have the same experience.
Yeah, that's powerful. Would some of the other composers like to respond to that first? Noam, do you have a feeling with that?
Certainly happened to me at least a few times. I mean, I'm not going to, and yes, the first example that came to mind was in fact a setting of poetry. There is, of course, also the case of, well, if there's going to, everybody who's written a fugue knows that if you're going to have a stretto, you have to figure that out first. So.
Well, unfortunately, that's not been the way I've done it, but yeah, I think that's a smarter way to do it. And I usually will come up with the subject first, then see it doesn't work with the stretto, and then end up changing the subject if I have to. Yeah.
So you are doing it, Jeff.
Yeah. You know, I think, Mark, for me, it works both ways. You know, sometimes I do start off with, so to speak, the favorite moment where I want, and then I have to figure out where things will build to and away from it. But many times I start with something I like, but I'm hoping I will discover a favorite moment or favorite moments as I go. And I think for me, that's one of the greatest pleasures I have in composition, where I have a sense of something that I want to lead to that, but I don't know where it's going to be. I mean, a recent example for me was this piano trio I wrote, Paleface, and the last movement, I knew I wanted to start it with this sense of descent. I started with chords ascending, you know, just with a sense of triads going down, because I knew the last movement was going to be about disintegration and apotheosis. But I didn't know how I was going to build that to a, so to speak, a moment. And when it came, it was so surprising to me that it didn't do what I thought it would do. I was dealing with all kinds of atmospheric textures in the piece. And then as I was playing with it, I came up with this, the tune that I end up using for the, you know, like that. And I was just like, where the hell did that come from? And you know, and then I backwards understood why I was meditating on that. And then I just had to ask myself, do I have the guts to just have a very simple, almost pop tune emerge from all of this? And that became, so to speak, as a composer, a favorite moment that kind of scared me because I wasn't prepared for it. But I use that as an example because I think some of my favorite experiences as a composer is those kinds of discoveries. Where I don't know from the beginning where it's going to lead. And of course, that's what makes, at least for me, composition such a time-consuming, difficult process, as opposed to some people who just kind of, they just get ideas and they just kind of run with it and they kind of know what they're going to do from the beginning. So I don't know if you've had that experience, but that's how I respond.
Well, sure, it does go both ways, but I like what you said about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, where a favorite moment sort of diffused into the whole first movement being favorite moments, and that's really the idea, to create composition that's all favorite moments. But if you sit down to do that, of course, you never will.
Yeah.
So I mean, you have to get it done somehow, and so I have had that experience of starting simply, and then I said, oh my goodness, look at all the nice things that are happening. And that's a different kind of thrill. In a way, starting with the favorite moment is the hardest because you sort of have to live up to that. But, but absolutely, it comes different ways, and I'm not choosy. I'll do anything I have to get the composition.
And sometimes, hopefully, one favorite moment leads to a second one.
Yes.
There's that. Yeah. Well, in other talks, I think I'd like to cover some of those topics as well. I just think it's so fun to be able to talk about these things on, you know, in terms of composition, you know, from the compositional aspect as well as from the listening aspect. I'm reading some, Gloria was asking, please elaborate on the psychological time. I'm going to do that in another afternoon because I want to spend more time with that. I think the difference between psychological versus real time is profound and something that composers deal with. It's so much of the essence of the process of composition. And so we'll get to that
because, you know, certain 20th century music appeals to me. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody besides myself has heard of Julius Eastman. Perhaps you have. And just Dynasty Battles was just pounding the piano to honor evil nigger, but it went through my body. I could feel it. I could feel the tension. I could feel the pain of his life. And so I probably answered in a sense my own question, but I still would like you to elaborate at a future time.
I will, but I'll talk about the psychological thing, but one of the, so far everyone's been eliciting favorite moments that I think if those of us who listen to classical music would all share if we know those pieces. But there are favorite moments I think that many of us have that are not the obvious ones. And I'm curious if some of you have those, because you can't, like you're saying, Gloria, not everyone resonates to the same things in music, right? And that's
about
something
the night music and the music for strings, percussion, and celeste, where he's doing a glissando and up and down the it's very eerie. And I already loved that for several years, when one night I was driving through the hills of Silver Lake on a windy road, and that came on the radio. And I actually had to pull over for a moment, because talk about shivers. It was so eerie in like 10 o'clock at night, feeling like, where's the ghost, or where's the, but wonderful moment. I don't know if that's obvious to most people, but it should be.
But it hits you at that particular time, right? And
it already was a favorite of mine. And then it was a very psychologically important part. My father had lived there and moved up to Berkeley, and I went by the house that we were emptying out to pick up some things, because I was just about to go off to med school in San Francisco. So I was picking up some things at that house to empty it out. So it sort of blended the psychology of doing this task, going to, saying goodbye to where my father used to live, going to see him, and the fact that it was happening on an eerie night, on a strange road. So it reinforced it.
I think the biographical element is extremely powerful for all of us. I mean, the joke I always tell my music listening classes is that most people's musical taste ends after high school or college, because they remember that as the best time of their lives. So the music they heard during that time, that's kind of the end of their musical growth for many people. But I think for all of us, we remember certain periods of our life when a particular piece was so important to us. I remember, I was listening to the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony when my brother was going through a very traumatic accident, and I know that it kind of cemented so many of those feelings I had, in my life with what I was hearing, in the piece. It resonated, because it works both ways. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes there's something in the music that seems to capture an emotion you're in, or an emotional place you're in. And Paul talking about how you were in this particular landscape with what was going on in your life, it hit you that way. I think, one of that can be a mass, so to speak, a mass delusion in a good way. We talked about the premiere of the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, where an entire populace that is being brutalized by Stalin and can't express themselves come to this concert where Shostakovich's music is literally crying it out, everything they can't express. And people apparently were sobbing in the aisles, right at the premiere performance, because he not only because the music was gorgeous, but it captured that zeitgeist perfectly. So I think there's a lot in that, actually. Yeah.
Can I go?
Yeah, please. Hi, Dave.
Hi. It was, as I was thinking, what I was going to say, I had to, I have more than three. It was kind of a little tricky to narrow them down, but so I've been listening to classical music for decades. One is, I have a couple of endings. The end of the Beauty and the Beast movement from the Ravel Mother Goose Suite. That just has this very quiet, kind of mysterious, very soft part in the strings, and then it has this very dissonant chord that builds up from the bottom very slowly, and then resolves into this beautiful major chord. I mean, it's just the genius of not only Ravel's work with harmony, but his orchestration is just perfectly encapsulated just in those couple of minutes. It's amazing.
I just want to enter, one of the problems with listening to Ravel is that almost every moment becomes a favorite moment when you really start to study it, because his orchestration is just so original and sublime at every moment, right?
Oh yeah, it's unbelievable. There's some other Ravel moments I can mention, but that's one that sticks out. Then about the last 2 minutes or so of the first movement of the Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony. I mean, I could listen to that symphony like once a month. But those last 2 minutes, about when that last theme comes in, first very soft with the brass, low strings, and then with the big percussion crashing in, and then how it gets soft and then crescendos up to this amazing slow building climax that just, wow, that was just the first movement. What's the rest of this going to be like? You know? And in fact, I had tickets to see that. Like I'm sure a lot of you had tickets to the LA Phil. That I was really looking. I love seeing that piece live. So that's another one. Sometimes when I listen to the symphony, I listen to that ending again just because I like it so much.
Which number symphony again?
Symphony number 5. I'll put all these in the chat.
Okay, symphony 5, of course, yeah.
The answer to your question of what comes next is, Sam, you made the pants too long.
Huh?
Think about the next movement.
Oh.
Sam, you made the pants too long. Bum.
Oh, I mean, that's the words you think of the theme. Actually, it goes to that
Right, after that.
Oh, I see. And then the third one is one I just recently discovered. I've listened to this piece a long time ago, but I think it's very appropriate for what we're going through now. It's kind of the main theme and then later climactic restatement of the main theme of the film music suite that Copland extracted from this score to Our Town. Mm-hmm. That is just gorgeous, evocative music. The Copland Our Town. It's about 9 minutes long. If you haven't listened to it, do yourself a favor and just relax and close your eyes and just picture what that music is depicting. The whole story of the production of that play it was very innovative for the time. So made to a film with a very young William Holden, and very interesting whole thing about it. But those three, I'll put them in the chat in case people.
That's really great. One of the most emotional experiences I had was being at the MacDowell Colony, where Copland composed Appalachian Spring. And that also happens to be where Thornton Wilder wrote Our Town. So there's a connection there with the MacDowell.
Terrific.
Yeah, certainly I agree with you. Copland, even at the time, certainly at the time he was writing it, as one of my students said, he's evoking an America we all want to have rather than the America that was. It was the kind of like the ideal. He captures that idealism that we want in there. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely makes us feel that sense of loss and hunger that we have now as we're going through something unprecedented. Good point.
Yes. Thank you.
Before I forget, I wanted to say, Paul, when you were talking about the Bartók, it was reminding me of not a glissando, but another thing that just always makes me shiver is the end of the first movement of the Shostakovich Fifth with the celesta, with that scale, it just seems it makes a summation of the movement, but not in a way you would ever expect, and it's so icy. And everything, it just completely, paralyzes you, even though all the music is so great. And that's the other thing, one favorite moment often leads to so many others as you get to know the piece. And then, if everything works right in a masterpiece, every moment becomes the favorite moment, right? And we're listening with that same arrested attention. And that's what I wanted to say about a favorite moment. It without needing to be anything intellectual about the piece in terms of how it's working or how long it's going to be. We're totally glued and fascinated with it. And then as we build to the whole piece being that favorite moment, we were able to follow with whole attention. Pop music makes it really, it's kind of like handicapped for handicap, you know, it's like challenge because there are training wheels, because the structure of the pop music is that the chorus is the favorite moment, right? Everything leads to the chorus, and then so the verse is this lead. So you kind of there's the semiotics of the pop song is that the favorite moment will always be the chorus, which they know you want to hear a lot, so they pre-repeat it for you. So you don't have to listen to it a lot of times. You can listen to it one time and hear it 1,000 times. I'm just saying that in jest, but I'm saying in our concert music we have to work a little harder sometimes, right? Yeah, I've got great music. I'm seeing Mother Goose. I so love that piece. Of course, this leads just to favorite pieces, but I'm glad you guys are talking about the real favorite moments.
I have a fun one, Russell.
Yeah.
You know, in the second movement of Schubert's Great C Major Symphony, he has this striding theme, this bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, and Schubert builds enormous momentum with this. And your brain starts to wonder, how is he going to resolve this? How are we going to get out of this?
Yeah.
And there's a point that it builds up, and it builds up to this enormous, unresolved, contentious note, and it just slams, and then it stops. It's just this. It's I believe it's called a hairpin.
Well, hairpin is a decrescendo, but yeah.
It's just a hairpin. Time stops, and the thing that is the magic moment is not the note itself, but the silence. It just, it just stops your heart. I saw Dudamel do this now 2 seasons ago, and the place was just silent as a tune there for a couple of seconds. That's my favorite.
I think you bring up a point we haven't talked about yet, that sometimes the favorite moment can be the absence of music. You're making me think of the other famous rest in Schubert from the Great B-flat Sonata, right? It's just so eerie to have that rest, for the trill, of course. There's that time certainly is arrested and stops.
Yeah, that's a stopping of time. It's the same thing. It's incredibly powerful.
So that's an example of a rest being a favorite moment.
Yeah, stop. It's the silence that hits you right in the face like a pie.
Yeah, and that's not the John Cage silence. That's
this
real
is,
silence.
This stops the universe. It's just an amazing instant there.
Great,
in
Afternoon of a Faun by Debussy, there's a wonderful measure of silence on the first page.
I didn't give it proper rest, but yeah, I love that example.
Most silence I've ever heard. Yeah.
That's a different silence than the Schubert too, because the Schubert,
right, it is.
The Schubert makes you realize that underneath all of this music is, I don't know if what you would want to call it death or whatever, but there is a dimension, a profound dimension lurking under it. Whereas the Debussy, for me, always makes me, it's like when you have a dream, when you wake up from a dream, did that happen or not? And I always feel like when the music comes in, like, did I just nod off? Or, it's like a glitch in the matrix. And I agree with you. It's an extraordinary thing. It happens right at the beginning too, right?
When I hear the Debussy, I feel there's beautiful music playing that's very pleasant. I just can't hear it. And so, so it's a very different. You're right. It's a completely different kind of silence than the Schubert, which is very eerie.
I love that idea that music's going on even though you can't hear it. Yeah.
Could I kind of piggyback on Debussy, because that was going to be one of my pieces, not that particular Debussy, but there are several rests in the piece that I was going to say is one of one of my favorite pieces, but within it there are many, and that's The Girl with the Flaxen Hair. I happen to be learning it right now, and it's really beautiful. And I actually had never thought about the rest, and I'm looking at the music, and there are several rests in that, just two pages of music that stops time for you. It really stops time for you. And I hadn't ever thought of it in the sense of there is something else going on in that timeless instant besides the lack of time. So thank you for that. That's
it's Mark.
Really interesting.
Mark, that's a really great.
Everyone should remember that the invention of the rest in music coincided with the invention of zero in mathematics. So it's just this kind of idea is relatively recent, like centuries old.
You're right. It's a kind of common. I mean, it's a recent discovery.
So what do you mean by that? A recent discovery? What are we talking about?
You don't really have, if you think about Roman numerals, there's no zero, and that leads to problems, like they get too long and cumbersome. And the idea of zero, it was very powerful in mathematics, but in music also, the idea of plain chants, I guess I actually have to think about that, of rests in very early music. But it becomes sort of shadow.
Well, you're talking about using rest as a psychological tool, and that is a very recent thing, because you don't really find that until I guess the Baroque era, at least in terms of notation, right?
There are rests before the Baroque, but you mean to use them as a device? Maybe not, but certainly rests are notated a long way before that.
Yeah, no, we're talking about them as a psychological idea. You're talking about tutti rests, right? We're talking about them as a way of stopping the music. I guess I was thinking the Baroque era, the pauses between slow movements, things like that. Which are basically suspensions. It's interesting.
There is a stage as well, the motet Pur Iore Spiro. Do I still breathe? Where he takes a breath in the middle of the re Spiro.
Well, that's true. Probably they had to do rest in terms, of course, in phrasing and breath. But I'm wondering if used as a psychological component, as
just as like tone painting. It's tone painting is using the breath, the rest as tone painting for the breath.
Oh, I see. For rest, yeah.
Do I still breathe?
Daniel, this is the Selah and the Psalms. These were rests.
Davidic Psalms, those were rests to reflect.
So the moments when for meditation, you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Thing, but I mean, it goes back a ways, but maybe it's different than the rests today.
It is different, but I think you make a good point, because I think we're talking about the rest as a psychological moment, in music. It's just it's when you start to when you think of Beethoven, for instance, it's one of the things, he's a master of the rest, and you see that in all great composers, how that. I mean, I think one of the problems I personally face as a composer, I don't know if the other composers share this, but I sometimes feel I get locked into too much continuity. And I think the guy who really started to break up continuity in music was C.P.E. Bach. And since then, we're dealing with all kinds of understandings of the psychological thing, the breaks that contrasts create. And rests in his sonatas are one of those powerful devices for making contrast, because you don't find that in his dad's music at all. It just flows like the river, like the brook, I should say. And then C.P.E. Bach, everything is this kind of gross starting and stopping of things, and using rests to do that.
Another really nice example is in the Magic Flute, when Tamino sings to the picture, the love aria. There's a beautiful rest, which actually almost gets to the Debussy level So
We could have,
Mozart really got the memo on the rest.
you're inspiring me. I think we may have to have a future topic where we do nothing but discuss rests, our favorite rests in music.
No, that's interesting. It's a great topic. It's really interesting.
Okay, well, let's meditate on that further, and then in the future we'll do something like that. Okay, okay. I'm delighted you guys all tuned in for this, and it's a lot of fun to see you, and a lot of fun to talk about all of this. Just kind of let our hair down. As you can see, I'm like many people in need of a haircut, and it's a lot of fun for me. So I'm going to continue this. If you guys are all into it, I'll do this next week. I've got a list of topics that go very long because I'm actually building to something I want to do, and this feedback is fantastic. And I think we'll work on that. I'll let you know the next topic. I'm trying to decide between two for next week, and please spread the word. And you're all welcome to be here. Any last comments before we check out?
I would just say that one of my favorite moments in music is the funny places, and I really like in Gollywog's Cakewalk where Debussy laughs at the Tristan chord.
That's great. That's great.
So I always love to play that. You know,
yeah,
it tickles me that you can actually make fun right in the middle of your piece.
we didn't talk about humorous favorite moments. That's interesting.
Yeah. I have one other, which is in Hebert's The Little White Donkey.
I don't know that piece.
It's a really cute piece. It starts bouncing along in the left hand, and the donkey just kicks up a lot of trouble with very dissonant chords. And at the very end of the piece, you end on this super soft little cluster up in the top. And then there's a rest. And then you play this big kick at the end, loud, on the piano. And when I performed it, I just loved that everybody chuckled, you know. And they were like, so I think we can look for more humor in the music now. That might help us all.
That's a really good point. We didn't bring that up.
It's another topic, maybe.
But it's a great topic because I remember, at least for me, so much, for instance, of Shostakovich, I hear, is absurdly funny. I mean, it's dark, but then there's some things that are funny. And I remember there was something he did in one of the symphony. I remember I was just laughing. I think it was in the 9th. And people got so upset with me, in the audience because I was disturbing this pristine thing. And I thought, you're kind of missing the point. He's really poking a lot of fun here.
Poking fun, yeah. Well, we should talk about poking fun sometime.
I like these are great ideas. Great ideas. Silence, humor, and poking fun. Okay, a lot to think about. I want to wish you all a great week and that we're all hanging in these, kind of unprecedented times and trying to be as creative and reflective as we can. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will you send us an email invite?
Well,
yeah, I'll send you an email for the next meeting. I'll get that out in a couple of days. Okay.
Thank you, Russell.
You're so welcome.
Great.
Nice to see you all.
Bye.
Hey, Bud Linda J. Bud Linda J. Hi, bye. Ciao.
Okay.
Russell.